Hello. I'm glad you've joined us in this online Bible study today. It's being done particularly for the members of the Westwood congregation in Tullahoma, Tennessee, where I work and worship. We are, because of the situation concerning the virus, having to meet in small groups from house to house until we can assemble together again in our meeting house. And I pray that'll be soon. But whether you're a member at Westwood in Tullahoma or you've come online to study with us from somewhere else, we welcome you and we want to encourage you to take your Bibles and follow along in our study. Today we want to begin with an introduction to the Gospel of Mark. We'll be looking at some passages in the Gospel of Mark and throughout the New Testament. As we get ready to go through the text, we want to get an idea as to who this writer of this gospel is and what's unique about this gospel as we prepare to go through in the study of the gospel itself. We're going to do this in a format that's like you were sitting here in my house across from the counter from me. And so I encourage you to get your Bibles and let's begin together. Of the four gospels, the Gospel of Mark, of course, is shorter in length, but it's not short in giving a powerful and vivid perspective of Jesus and his ministry. It's believed that this is not the Mark of the 12 apostles, but rather John Mark, of whom there's 8 New Testament references. There's 4 in the book of Acts, there's 3 references in the letters of Paul, and there's 1 reference in the first letter of Peter. And from these, we find that Mark is the son of a woman named Mary. If you look over at Acts chapter 12, of course, the context of this is when Peter had been cast into prison. James, the apostle, the brother of John, had just been recently beheaded by Herod. And he saw that pleased the Jews, so he had imprisoned Peter evidently to do the same thing. But God intervenes with the angel and releases Peter. And we read here in chapter 12, in verse 12, that he leaves and goes to the house of Mary, where some of the brethren were there. And they were praying for Peter. It tells us that John Mark was the son of this Mary. We read about him again a little later in chapter 12. In chapter 12 in verse 25, this is when they were going to go on their first journey, Paul and Barnabas on the first preaching journey to the Gentiles. And we read that John Mark goes along with them. We learn in another letter, if you hold your place there and look over at Colossians chapter 4 and verse 10, there Paul is writing to the Colossian brethren, and he mentions John Mark being the cousin of Barnabas. So here's John Mark in Acts chapter 12 and verse 25. Paul and Barnabas are about to strike out on this first preaching journey, and Barnabas takes along with him his younger cousin John Mark. He goes with them across the island of Cyprus and then across the sea, and goes as far as Pamphylia, but then at that point, for some reason or another, John Mark turns back. At that time, that was a great disappointment to the Apostle Paul, to the point that when it came time for the second journey that we read about in Acts chapter 15, in verse 37, when Barnabas wanted to take John Mark back, it says he wanted to take him back along with him the second time. Paul had a disagreement about that because he had left them and didn't continue to the work, he said. And this became such a sharp disagreement over Mark that they separated. And Paul took Silas as his companion and Barnabas took Mark. And that may, of course, been God's providence so that the gospel go in 2 different directions. But whatever disappointments Paul had in John Mark were taken care of in time. We see later in Paul's letters that John Mark evidently had completely regained Paul's confidence, and we find him, in fact, with Paul in his first imprisonment in Rome, in the letter to Philemon that was sent by his slave. Paul mentions that John Mark is there in prison with him. In Philemon chapter 1, in just one chapter to Philemon verse 24, he mentions giving greetings from Mark and Aristarchus and Demas and Luke, and he calls them fellow workers. So by this time had passed. He gained the confidence again of the Apostle Paul. He's there with him in his imprisonment in Rome, and Paul refers to him as a fellow worker. He meant so much to Paul. In fact, in the latter days of Paul's last imprisonment in Rome, when he's writing Timothy, telling him he's being poured out as a drink offering, the time of his departure had come. He's calling for Timothy to come before winter and bring some things. He says in 2 Timothy, if you look at that, in 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 11, he says, "Only Luke is with me. Pick up Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful service to me." So he gained the confidence of Paul and was a fellow worker, and meant a lot to him in his service in his later years. John Mark is also mentioned by Peter, as we said in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 13. He mentions Mark as his son. And that may indicate that Peter converted Mark. Many believe, and because of strong tradition and internal evidence, that Mark's account is really a record of the things that he heard from Peter, and was inspired to write those down. He has some very vivid, as we said, things to say about the events that took place, and it would have taken eyewitness testimony, which he heard. But why this account? Why a short version with having the other three Gospels? It's true that most of the accounts that Mark mentions can be found in the other Gospels. In fact, you can only find about 50 verses that could be classified as being peculiar to this Gospel from the others. But each Gospel, though they are telling about the same good news concerning Jesus Christ, they tell the story from a little different perspective. And there's none more vivid than what we get from the Gospel of Mark. Matthew writes, seems to a Jewish audience, showing Jesus to be the King of the Jews, the Messiah that was predicted in the Old Testament, which the Jews would have been familiar with those passages. And he points out those references, saying, "as it is written," many times, or "just as the prophet Isaiah hath said." Then you have Luke, the meticulous historian and reporter, who investigated, he said, and compiled things and wrote them out in consecutive order as he showed Jesus to be the divine Son of God, as he wrote to a man by the name of Theophilus. Then there's John with his different perspective. He writes with divine restraint. Here was one of the closest people to Jesus, the beloved John, the apostle. And he's divinely restrained in his account because he only chooses 7 miracles, which he calls signs, that points to who Jesus was as the Son of God. 7 signs besides the resurrection and the draft Ephesians after the resurrection. No doubt he wanted to write many other things. And in chapter 20, he tells us that there were many other things. Many other signs, he said, Jesus did in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But he said, these are written that you may believe that Jesus the Christ, the Son of God, and believing you might have life in his name. God restrained him to write about those, and he said that was enough to believe. But he wants us to know there was so much more. Back in the last chapter, in chapter 21, John says, if everything was written about Jesus, he said, I suppose the world couldn't contain the books that were written. So what's Mark going to add to that? Though Mark may tell us some of the same events, if you want a definite account with full information, then look at Mark. He gives you names, he gives exact names and times and locations and numbers and even colors. Mark paints a picture for you. And that's what's so wonderful, as we'll see in the study of this book. It'll allow you to see even the gestures of Jesus and his emotions. It's wonderful to read the things of Jesus, but to see his facial expressions would be wonderful, wouldn't it? Mark paints that for you. He paints the events of things around, lets you see what it looks like as you're reading. For example, if you'll take your Bibles and look over to Mark chapter 6, you look down at verse 39. And here, of course, this is the account of when Jesus was going to feed the multitudes, and they have them all to sit down in different groups on the ground. But Mark here tells us not only did he have them sit on the ground, but he had them sit on the grass. And he not only explains that, but he paints a picture for you. He says he has them sit down on the green grass. He paints a picture for us. You turn back just a little ways to chapter 4. You look at verse 38, and here's the Lord during the storm. He's there on the sea, and he's in the boat, and he's sleeping in the boat, and we learn that from other places. But here, in verse 38, it tells us that he was in the boat asleep in the stern of the boat, asleep on a cushion. And they awoke him and said, "Teacher, do you not care that we're perishing?" So he tells us where he was and how he was laying and what he was laying on. You come over to chapter 10 and look at verses 13 and 14. And they brought the children to Jesus. But here he uses a word that lets us know that they were little children. They brought the little children to him. And it's Mark who tells us that he took them in his arms and he blessed them. He paints a picture for us. You come back to chapter 5 in verse 41. Now, this is where he's raising from the dead the daughter of the official who come to Jesus. And other accounts, like Matthew, tells us that it was a girl. It tells us it was his daughter. But here in chapter 5 and verse 41 of Mark, we see that she was a very young girl, because it says he took the child's hand and raised her up from the sleep of death. Very vivid picture. You turn back over to chapter 10 again, and in verse 21, other places we read about Jesus speaking to the rich young ruler. But it's Mark that tells us that Jesus, looking at him, he felt a love for him. Again, that gives us more of what's going on in Jesus. You can see him just looking intently at this young man and feeling and then telling him the truth, that there's one thing that he lacked because of his love for him. Another example would be back in chapter 3. If you look at chapter 3 and verse 5, Jesus here, this is just before he heals the man with the withered hand. We see his expression and we see his emotion as he tells us there in verse 2 that they were watching him to see if he would heal on the Sabbath so that they might have reason to accuse him. He said to the man with the withered hand, "Get up and come forward." And then he said to him in verse 4, he says, "Is it lawful to do good or harm on the Sabbath? Is it safe to save a life or to kill?" They wouldn't say anything. They just kept silent. Then notice verse 5. It says, and looking around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. So he just doesn't tell us what the people were doing and what they were thinking and what Jesus did. He shows us Jesus' expression. Before he told the man, stretch out your hand, he looked around, and you can see the expression on Jesus' face. He looked at them with anger and was grieved over their hardness of heart. There's other illustrations, but what I'm trying to get across as we go through this, we're going to see that Mark paints a picture for us. It's a wonderful gospel to study. And where Matthew writes more for a Jewish audience, as we said, Mark seems to write for more the everyday Roman. He uses a lot of Roman terms, not as many Old Testament references like Matthew. And he explains Jewish customs and translates many of the Jewish expressions that were in Aramaic that would have been understood by the Jews but not by the Romans. He was John Mark. John was his Hebrew name. Mark would have been his Greek name. And so he's writing especially to show Jesus as the servant of God to everyone around, not just the Jews, but also to those who have been Gentiles. He's the servant of God and man. And you see that. I suppose if you were to look for one passage in Mark that sums up the whole gospel, it would be chapter 10 and verse 45, where Jesus says, for even the Son of Man did not come to serve, but to be served, but to serve and give his life a ransom for many. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life a ransom for many. This sums up really the whole gospel of Mark. Those two things, coming to serve and give his life a ransom for many. You can break the book down in those two parts. Chapters 1 through 9 show his ministry and his service as he labored in Galilee, preaching and teaching. He came serving. And then chapters 10 through 16, the second half of the book, we see his journey toward Jerusalem as he set his face toward the cross and giving his life a ransom for many. That's the good news about Jesus Christ. He came to die for us. He came to pay the price that we couldn't pay. You think about a ransom note, someone asking for payment. Jesus gave his life as a ransom for us. We deserve the wages of our sin. The wages of sin is death, Romans chapter 6, verse 23. And chapter 3 and verse 23 of Romans, all sin and fall short of the glory of God. All of us need to be ransomed. All of us need to be redeemed, a price paid that we can't pay to get our salvation and to be in a right standing before God. It took the life of Jesus to do that. So he came to this earth and he went through his ministry of showing who he was by his preaching and his miracles. And here in Mark we've got 19 miracles and 4 parables that set about in this unique account of a very beautiful picture of Jesus who came to serve and give his life as a ransom for us. So there's an introduction to the Gospel of Mark. I'm glad you've joined us online today. I encourage you now to take the time between now and the next lesson that we have and to read the Gospel of Mark. Maybe during this quarantine you have some extra time. I've noticed some people talking about having some time to read and read things for themselves. Read the Gospel of Mark. It's only 16 chapters right there. It's just the Gospel of Mark. Very short. You can read it in a pretty short period of time. Familiarize yourself more with this wonderful gospel. And then when we come back, we'll look in the second lesson. It'll be posted here hopefully before Sunday, the Lord willing. and then we'll begin studying the text. But until then, may the Lord bless us and keep us safe and well, and I hope you have a good day.